In 1993, the American Freight Railroad was the circulatory system of the industrial economy. 7 Class I carriers operated more than 140,000 miles of track, moving 30% of all U.S. cargo by weight, more than any other mode of freight transportation on the continent. These were not glamorous jobs, but they were permanent ones. A carman walked every car in a consist before departure, spending 2.5 minutes per car looking for hot axle boxes and cracked wheels before a 10,000-ton manifest freight train left the yard. Train masters directed the movement of thousands of railcars through classification yards covering hundreds of acres. A hostler moved locomotives between the engine house and the departure track before every outbound run. Roundhouse foremen supervised the mechanical inspections that federal regulation required before any locomotive cleared the facility. Division dispatchers coordinated train movements across hundreds of miles of single-track main line, holding in memory the position of every train on every subdivision they controlled. Brakemen and conductors had been running American freight since the Transcontinental Railroad was completed in 1869. The industry employed approximately 184,000 people. The operating ratio, the industry's measure of how much it spent to earn each dollar of revenue, averaged 83% across the Class I system. Wall Street considered railroads a slow, bloated, unglamorous legacy industry. That year, a 48-year-old executive in Memphis decided he knew how to change that. His name was E. Hunter Harrison. Harrison had started in the industry in 1963 at age 19, oiling axle boxes at a St. Louis-San Francisco Railway freight yard in Memphis, the same entry-level job as the carman he would later cut by the thousands. He rose to trainmaster at 28. By 1989, he had joined Illinois Central Railroad as Vice President of Operations. By 1993, he was CEO. Illinois Central's operating ratio when he arrived was 98%. The railroad was spending 98 cents to earn each dollar of revenue. Harrison called that obscene. In 3 years, he drove the operating ratio from 98% to approximately 65%, a margin no comparable railroad had reached, while the industry average was still 83%. Morgan Stanley analyst James Valentine published a note that year calling Harrison one of a kind, an industry maverick blazing the trail to a 60% operating ratio or lower. Wall Street had found its profit. The strategy Harrison developed had a name that implied something technical and neutral: precision scheduled railroading, called PSR. What PSR actually prescribed was operationally simple: run longer trains on fixed schedules, use the fewest possible assets, and treat every component of the railroad as a cost to be minimized until the operating ratio could not fall further. Harrison described his own formula directly. What train velocity does for efficiency, what longer trains mean for efficiency. The words "fewer workers" appeared nowhere in that sentence. They did not need to. When Canadian National acquired Illinois Central in 1998 and brought Harrison north to implement PSR at continental scale, the math was identical. Before PSR at Canadian National, delivery times were quoted in days. Harrison wanted them quoted in hours. Canadian National's operating ratio fell from 89% in 1998 to 61% in 2006, far below any competitor. Canadian National's share price climbed from $4.93 to $27.18 across the same 11 years. At Illinois Central, Harrison had applied PSR to a regional system of approximately 2,700 route miles. Canadian National operated 19,000 miles spanning 2 countries, from New Orleans to Halifax to Vancouver. The scale difference meant the job losses were proportionally larger, the yard closures more disruptive, and the internal resistance more entrenched, which Harrison resolved by the same method he had used at Illinois Central: identifying the resistors and removing them. To accelerate cultural adoption inside the organization, Harrison created what he called Hunter Camps, 3-day management sessions that he ran personally. More than 1,800 Canadian National employees at all levels passed through Hunter Camps before Harrison retired as President and Chief Executive Officer in 2009. The core message at each session was the same: The railroad's resources, including its workforce, existed to serve the operating ratio. Harrison retired to his Connecticut estate, where he bred show-jumping horses. He lasted 2 years. In fall 2011, hedge fund manager Bill Ackman launched a proxy battle at Canadian Pacific Railway. Canadian Pacific was, in Ackman's assessment, a railroad carrying a bloated workforce and significant untapped shareholder value. The solution Ackman had in mind was Hunter Harrison. By June 2012, Ackman had won the proxy battle, and Harrison was installed as Canadian Pacific's chief executive officer. In December 2012, Harrison announced his plan, not as a contingency, but as a formal corporate document filed with investors. The target was a 23% workforce reduction, approximately 4,500 positions, to be completed by 2016. Canadian Pacific employed roughly 19,000 workers when Harrison arrived. By the end of 2016, that number had fallen below 12,000. Harrison had removed more than one-third of Canadian Pacific's workforce in 4 years. Canadian Pacific's operating ratio dropped from 81.6% in 2011 to 63.3% by 2016. Canadian Pacific's shareholders received the return they had been promised. In January 2017, Harrison resigned abruptly from Canadian Pacific. He joined hedge fund manager Paul Hilal at a new vehicle called Mantle Ridge, and their next target was CSX Transportation, the third largest Class 1 railroad in the United States, operating 21,000 miles of track across 23 states east of the Mississippi. CSX agreed to pay Harrison $84 million to cover the deferred compensation he had forfeited leaving Canadian Pacific. His full 4-year contract was valued at approximately $300 million if performance targets were met. CSX stock soared 23% the day news broke that Harrison was departing Canadian Pacific before he had walked through a single CSX door. By the time Harrison formally joined CSX on March 6, 2017, the market had added approximately $14.9 billion in capitalization based solely on the expectation of what he would do to the organization. In the next 8 months, Harrison fired 4,000 CSX employees and contractors, took roughly 1,000 locomotives offline, and closed 9 classification yards. By July 2017, CSX shipping customers were filing complaints with the Surface Transportation Board. The Surface Transportation Board sent CSX a formal letter citing reports that service had deteriorated markedly in the second quarter of 2017, forcing shippers to curtail production and temporarily halt operations. Harrison dismissed the complaints publicly. He continued to assert that service disruptions were the customer's fault for failing to adapt to the new operating model. On October 11, 2017, the Surface Transportation Board convened a public listening session. Harrison appeared. He told the board he saw no point in CSX participating in the Chicago Transportation Coordination Office, the industry's own shared performance reporting system, and declared it irrelevant to his objectives. During the same session, he said he had blood all over his hands from injuries in this industry that should have been avoidable. He was speaking about his career broadly. His successors would later be asked to speak about East Palestine. On December 14, 2017, Harrison was placed on medical leave. 2 days later, E. Hunter Harrison died in Wellington, Florida, at the age of 73. CSX stock fell 7.3% the day he died. Financial journalists eulogized him as a visionary, leading with the operating ratios he had driven from the 70s, the 80s, and the 90s down into the 50s and 60s across 4 major railroads. What those obituaries did not lead with was more than 7,000 Canadian Pacific workers removed in 4 years, 4,000 CSX workers removed in 8 months, and that same playbook now running at every remaining Class 1 railroad in North America through the executives Harrison had personally trained. Jim Foote, who had worked under Harrison at Canadian National for 11 years, became acting chief executive officer of CSX that December and immediately pledged that precision scheduled railroading was in place. Jim Vena, who had served as Canadian National's chief operating officer under Harrison, was installed to lead Union Pacific's precision scheduled railroading program. Keith Creel, another Canadian national veteran, ran Canadian Pacific. E. Hunter Harrison was dead, but his operating doctrine was now institutional law. From 2011 to 2021, the Class 1 freight railroad workforce declined by approximately 28%, according to the Government Accountability Office. Workers who remained on the payroll handled more tons per person hour than any previous generation of freight railroaders in American history, without additional compensation, without scheduling relief, and without the buffer workforce that had once absorbed the system's variability. The Bureau of Labor Statistics recorded the most acute period. Between November 2018 and December 2020, rail transportation shed 40,000 jobs, the fastest employment contraction of any American industry in that period. Union Pacific alone removed more than 10,000 positions, a 25% reduction in under a decade. The work did not disappear with the workers. Average train length grew by approximately 25% between 2008 and 2019, with some consists extending beyond 3 miles. A crew of 2 now manage trains that once required more hands at more points along the route. Car inspection windows shrank at the same rate as the headcount. At Norfolk Southern, inspection time per car had been set at no more than 2.5 minutes in 2016. By the early 2020s, that window had been cut to 90 seconds. 90 seconds to examine a freight car up to 100 feet long, potentially carrying chlorine, vinyl chloride, or butyl acrylate. The workforce reduction and the inspection reduction were not unrelated decisions. Both were products of the same operating model, the same operating ratio logic, and the same documented institutional mandate. As the workforce shrank, shareholder returns grew. Union Pacific spent $8.2 billion on stock buybacks in 2018 alone and $5.8 billion in 2019. In the first 9 months of 2022, the 7 major freight railroads collectively earned $21 billion in profits and returned $25 billion to shareholders through buybacks and dividends. In that same year, 4 of the 12 freight rail unions, representing more than half of the 115,000 workers covered by the national contract, voted down a tentative agreement. The primary reason those workers voted no was not wages. The workers had 0 guaranteed paid sick days. Under the Precision Scheduled Attendance Management Systems that Precision Scheduled Railroading, PSR, had introduced across the Class 1 system, calling in sick the morning of a shift was a disciplinary offense. Workers had to request personal time days in advance, which Howard Green, E. Hunter Harrison's biographer, described as impossible to reconcile with unpredictable illness. The railroad had made it operationally unacceptable to be human. Congress intervened in December 2022 under the Railway Labor Act to prevent a national strike. On December 1, 2022, the Senate voted 52 to 43 in favor of an amendment that would have added 7 days of paid sick leave to the imposed contract. That vote fell short of the 60-vote threshold required to overcome a filibuster. Congress imposed the contract without sick days. Workers who had been furloughed in 2020 called back at 2 hours' notice and required to hold themselves available for 70-hour weeks with no scheduled recovery time received 1 paid sick day. The Association of American Railroads spent over $3.5 million lobbying Congress that year alone. Union Pacific contributed $30,000 directly to both the Democratic Congressional Campaign Committee and the National Republican Senatorial Committee in the 2022 election cycle. On February 3, 2023, at 8:55 in the evening, Norfolk Southern Train 32N entered East Palestine, Ohio. The 141-car manifest freight train was carrying hazardous materials in 20 of its cars. A roller bearing on a hopper car had been overheating for miles, registered by wayside hotbox detectors that logged temperature readings at fixed intervals along the route. The communication chain did not stop the train in time. 38 cars derailed. 11 of those cars carried hazardous materials. 3 days later, a controlled vent and burn of vinyl chloride was conducted. The Federal Railroad Administration's final accident investigation report found that Norfolk Southern's inadequate staffing for communicating information from hotbox detectors contributed to the derailment. Subsequent environmental analysis found pollutant impacts extending across 1.4 million square kilometers, affecting portions of 16 states. Norfolk Southern's chief executive officer described the derailment as a wake-up call for the industry. A 2019 GAO report had already documented that train lengths increased 25% between 2008 and 2019, while staffing fell 30%. A 2022 STB hearing had already required the 4 largest Class 1 railroads to testify about service deficiencies and file plans for improvement. Norfolk Southern had largely ignored portions of that order, according to subsequent reporting. Harrison told the STB in October 2017 that he had blood on his hands from injuries that should have been avoidable. The industry transcribed those words and continued. Since 2015, the 6 publicly traded Class 1 railroads have spent more than $165 billion on stock buybacks, at least $46 billion more than they invested in safety during the same period. Railroad stock prices have risen by more than 676% since 2004. The workforce is still down, approximately 35% from its 2015 level. Harrison described his management philosophy in a Fortune magazine interview in August 2017, 4 months before his death. He said that cultures change one funeral at a time, explaining how he removed organizational resistance. That phrase is accurate in ways Harrison may not have intended. The conductors, carmen, trainmasters, and inspectors who built and maintained the American Freight Railroad did not lose their jobs because the railroad declined. Freight volume in 2020 was higher than it had been in 2000, and there were 35% fewer workers to move it. Those jobs were removed because a documented strategy, designed by a named executive, extended by named successors, and funded by named hedge funds, classified the workforce as the single largest variable cost in the operating ratio. That strategy was explicit. It was written in investor documents, announced on earnings calls, praised in Morgan Stanley research notes, and confirmed by the GAO in a federal report. Harrison accepted responsibility for the deaths it produced. He did so in a single sentence in a federal regulatory session 2 months before he died. The industry accepted his statement, closed the session, and continued. The Surface Transportation Board held hearings. Congress imposed a contract. Federal accident investigators published findings that named inadequate staffing as a contributing factor to a chemical disaster in a residential American community. Workers who voted no in December 2022 are still working under the contract that was imposed on them without their consent. Railroad operating ratios are still the metric that drives every capital allocation decision. $165 billion went to shareholders between 2015 and 2023, while safety investment trailed that figure by at least $46 billion. 90 seconds per car is still the inspection standard at major Class 1 carriers. None of the men who designed, funded, and implemented this strategy have answered for any of it in any proceeding that carried consequences. That is not the absence of information. That is a documented institutional choice.